All right, I am recording this video now for the third time. And I'm in the podcast studio. Originally, I was outside on location where it makes sense for me to be recording this video, but the mics that I was using, I think I need to throw them away because the audio wasn't any good. And then here in the podcast studio, I recorded the whole video and didn't realize that I didn't hit the record button. So here we are, a third time. So if I seem a little frustrated, forgive me, but I'm here, okay? And we are talking 5 tips to use off-camera flash outdoors without making it look like you're using off-camera flash. So without wasting any more time, let's jump right into these tips. Now, tip number 1, you want the quality of light and the hardness or softness of your off-camera flash to be equal or comparable to the ambient light that you have. So if you're on location and your ambient light is the sun and it's, a hard light source, you have hard shadows, you want your flash to mimic that because it wouldn't make sense. And again, the goal is to make it look like you're not using flash. It wouldn't make sense to have this hard contrasty light in your ambient situation, but yet the light that you have on your subject is very soft. That's going to be a telltale sign that you're using some sort of external light source. So you really need to make sure that whatever light you're introducing on your subject matches the light that you have in your scene. So if it's hard light, you want hard light. If it's an overcast day, so it's soft light, you want that soft light. Tip number 2, and this goes along with tip number 1, you want to use a modifier that's going to help you get the light that you need to match your ambient light. So if I'm outdoors and it's a hard light, I'm going to use a bare flash or a 7-inch reflector or maybe a 22-inch beauty disc without a sock. That's going to help me get that hard contrasty directional light that's going to match the overall feel and vibe of my ambient conditions. Likewise, if I'm in an overcast situation, I don't want to use a hard light source because if it's cloudy, yet I've got hard shadows on my subject's face, again, that's a telltale sign that that subject is being lit with some external light source. So you want to use a modifier that's going to help you get the light that you need to match your ambient. Tip number 3, you want your flash to be coming in the same direction as the light in your ambient situation. So if I'm outdoors right now and I've got the sun coming in this way right here, it's not going to make sense for me then to have my light coming in from this way, because now the light that's going to essentially be lighting me is going to be coming from a different direction than the light in the scene overall. And that's just not going to blend the two very well together. And again, the goal is to make it look like you're not using any sort of flash or external light source. So to be able to achieve that, you need to have your light, your external light source coming from the same direction, the general same direction as whatever light is in your scene. Now, that's not to say that if the sun is right here, you got to put your flash right here. Definitely not saying that, but you kind of want to have it in that same general area so that way it matches. Tip number 4, and this is a very obvious one, but tip number 4 is you want to make sure that your external flash, your external light source is not too powerful. You don't want to introduce too much light because then clearly it's going to be obvious that you're using some sort of flash or external light source. So if you make sure that you adhere to tips 1 through 3, that puts you in a very good position for tip number 4, because everything will be in place to really blend that light in. And all you have to do is make sure that you're not introducing too much external light to the point where it's obvious that you're using an external light source. So you want to have a nice balance. Now, I don't use light meters all the time, but when I do, in this situation, I strive to have my external light source be 20% or less of the overall exposure. And I found that that's a very good sweet spot for me, to where if I stay at or below that 20%, then the light that I'm introducing stays relatively natural. So what that means is the overall exposure, 80% is coming from the ambient, 20% is coming from my flash. So I like to be 20% or less. But the important thing is you don't want to introduce too much light from your external light source. And tip number 5, and this is probably the most important, is that you want to make sure that your ambient light, in terms of your settings and how you expose your ambient light, you want to make sure that it's not too dark. Something that I preach to photographers all the time is that when you're trying to make an image look natural, you have to have a balance between the exposure of your ambient light and the exposure on your subject. If you expose for your ambient light and it's too dark, but then you have all this light on your subject, it's going to be obvious that you lit your subject with some sort of external light source. So if you think about this, if you are shooting right as the sun is going down, obviously the ambient light, there's not a lot of it, right? So if you have a very bright subject, but yet your background is semi-dark, it's clear that you lit your subject with something. So you want to expose your ambient light to be something that feels natural. So I normally try to get my starting point to be right even in the meter. So I use my camera meter. So if I have it right at 0, that's a good starting point. Depending upon what I'm shooting and what's in the background, I might have to adjust that here or there. But I want to make sure that the ambient is bright enough to where when I add that pop of my external light source, it's not going to make my subject too bright to where it isn't believable. So it's extremely important to make sure that that light is where it needs to be. Now, in saying that, you have to keep in mind that depending upon how much light you have available, your ambient light, that's going to dictate how much light you could put on your subject. So you may not be able to light your subject as bright as you would want to possibly. But if you want to make it look like your subject was lit with the natural light, then that's what has to happen. Again, going back to my low light, evening light situation, if it's evening time and I'm just using natural light, it is what it is. There's only so much light. And so if I'm relying on what's available to light my subject, I'm only going to be able to light them so much with that low amount of light. Likewise, if I'm shooting midday, I have a lot of latitude of how much light I could put on my subject because there's so much available light that it's believable that my subject could be pretty bright because it's a bright sunny day. So how much available light you have is really going to dictate how much of that flash you could use to light your subject. Now, in saying all of these things, something that's very important to keep in mind is that this really only matters, for the most part, this really only matters when you're shooting wide enough to have your location or where you are in your scene. Okay, if you're shooting with a telephoto, so you're at 85 or 105 or 135 and your subject is filling the frame and you're shooting wide open or close to it, so your background is blurred out, this really doesn't matter too much because the viewer is not going to have any perception to be able to compare one thing to another to even have that thought. There really isn't enough detail in the image for you to really be able to dictate if something was lit by a flash or not, with the exception of tip number 5. If your ambient, what the available background is super dark and your subject is super bright, that's the telltale sign. But the other things, the things that really give it away is the environment, right? So if you can see the environment and you can see shadows, for example, that's going to kind of tell you where the main light source is coming from. So if I'm looking at the environment of the shot and I can see the shadows going in one direction, but yet then your subject is lit from the opposite direction, then I'm going to immediately know that there was some sort of external light that lit them. So the environment is kind of necessary to make that assessment. So if you're shooting tight, this doesn't play a factor too much with the exception of how you expose for the ambient. So that's just something to keep in mind. So to go back to those tips really quick, tip number 1, you want your light source to match the quality and hardness / softness of your ambient light source. Tip number 2, you want to use a modifier that's going to help you achieve that light. Tip number 3, you want to make sure that your light source is coming from the same direction in general as your ambient light source. Tip number 4, you want to make sure you're not using too much power. You don't want to introduce too much flash power. And tip number 5, you want to make sure your ambient light is exposed to something that's bright enough to where you can balance it and it makes sense. So with that being said, I want to see how I can figure out how to incorporate my original video to give you an example, because I did give a demonstration on location. I guess I could play it. The audio is not going to be great, so don't give me a hard time about the audio, because the audio isn't great. But I quickly want to cut to that just so that way I can show you the example of how I balance the two. All right, so let's start with taking the ambient exposure. So let's kind of look at my settings here. Yep, I think that's pretty good right there. So if I take that shot, you can see that's what it looks like. Clearly she's in shadow. Now, granted, she's being cast by this. I'm creating my own shadow, but you get the point, right? So Quinn is definitely dark, could use some light, but we don't want to make it look flashy. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and turn the speed light on. So right now it's set to 8 power. So let's just take that and see how it looks. So that's actually not bad. It's not bad, but to me that still looks flashy. And the thing that gives it away is I think she's a little too overexposed for the ambient. I think if she was being lit, she wouldn't be that bright still. She would be down just a little bit. So I'm going to drop that down one stop and take that shot. Now that's starting to look more natural right there. Now, of course, I'm using a 24 mil, so I'm super close to this distortion. So don't mind the distortion. But I think that looks really good, and that really could be believable on that just being ambient light. Now in this particular shot, there really aren't any shadows that we're having to contend with, because as I said, the sun is pretty low, so we're actually getting some pretty decent soft light. So that's fine right there. Now going back to the shot that I just took, I think that still can work as well. And depending upon, where I have my light and making sure that I'm not creating any shadows that shouldn't be there, that could be believable as well. But I think the other shot at 1/16 power, I think, is more believable in terms of making it look like ambient. So there you have it. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you appreciated this video. This will be my last video for the year. So happy New Year. Be safe, be prosperous, and I'll see you next year.